Hello everyone, welcome back to My Hero Academia Podfics. Today I'll be continuing with Part 3, Chapter 3 of Deku and Death. This chapter is entitled, Promise That You'll Catch Me. Izuku woke up the next morning with a groan. Squinting as he sat up from his bed, the curtains had been widely drawn and the early sunrise was seeping through his windows. This must have been Gami's way of waking him up, and while Izuku appreciated it, he wasn't sure he was used to waking up this early. The boy turned to see the all-night clock that rested on his nightstand. It displayed a bright 5:34 a.m. in a red glow. Izuku sighed and turned off the clock, and so the programmed alarm wouldn't ring. Then he headed back towards his desk. Adjusting to this new schedule might be harder than he initially thought. Quietly, Izuku pulled out the chair before plopping himself down and scooting it back in place. Gami watched proudly as the small child waved out his hand, summoning the monochromatic flames effortlessly. Then he reached a thin hand for one of the many souls surrounding the boy before picking it up and handing it to him. "Here," Gami said softly. "I will bring you the ones closest to expiring. That way you can work more efficiently." Izuku managed to lift his tired face into a smile that simply lit up Gami's dull heart. He couldn't explain it, but seeing the young boy so happy filled him with such a warm and comforting feeling. It was like Izuku's positivity radiated off of him, as if it was contagious. He wanted so badly to get attached, but he reminded himself that he was only here to help Izuku learn his new role. After all, he retired so that he could finally move on. There was just no way he could let himself get attached here. "Ah, thank you, Gami," Izuku whispered tiredly, grabbing the orb of light that his friend had handed to him. Could he even consider Gami a friend? Izuku wanted to, but he wasn't sure the man had felt the same. Hearing him say that his stay was only temporary brought a heaviness to the boy's heart. He enjoyed Gami's company so much, even though they had only met less than a day ago, but who was he to deny the rest of a man who had worked non-stop for 5 centuries? Trying to keep Gami around for his own happiness just seemed too cruel. The two of them didn't say any of this out loud, of course. They just continued to work in silence, Gami passing souls to Izuku as he sorted them. They flowed together rather well, like a well-oiled machine. The silence wasn't necessarily awkward. Both of them could tell the other was itching to speak, but silence was appropriate for the moment. For Gami, it was early, and Izuku was still tired. He didn't want to wear the boy down more than he already was. For Izuku, it was early, and his parents were still asleep. Sure, he wanted to talk with Gami, but the fear of one of his parents stumbling in on him sitting at his desk, seemingly talking to no one, early in the morning was enough to keep him silent. It was around 6:15-ish when the silence was disturbed, not by one of them, but by the sound of a door closing. Izuku froze in his tracks, completely still, and slowly turned his head towards the door. He could hear footsteps in the hallway coming towards his room. He turned towards Gami, unsure of what to do as the footsteps came closer. Gami shrugged indifferently, but Izuku could tell by his posture that the man was panicked as well. Trying to get back to bed wasn't an option, as he would make way too much noise and give himself away, nor was hiding under his desk, as whoever walked in would clearly see that the room was empty and start searching for Izuku, which would only lead to more problems. So Izuku braced himself as the footsteps got even closer, rehearsing a half-baked explanation of what he was doing out of bed that early. But the footsteps didn't stop at his door like he was expecting. Instead, they walked right past it and continued down the hallway. Izuku let out an inaudible breath he didn't know he was holding, and slowly got out of the desk chair. Ever so quietly, he creeped towards his door and pressed his ear against the hard wood. Gami followed him silently and stood at the wall next to the door. There, the two listened. They listened as the footsteps finally stopped, reaching what Izuku assumed to be the front door. They listened as he could make out the sound of shoes being slipped on and sliding against the doormat. They listened as the familiar jingle of keys being taken off their designated hook rang out in the hallway, just soft enough that anyone asleep would completely miss it. They listened as the front door opened and then closed. Izuku managed to get back to working after the tension of almost getting caught but not really He and Gami had no further interruptions for the rest of the morning. It was only around 2 hours later, about 8-ish, that Gami insisted that the boy could stop, clarifying that the oldest soul currently still had 8 hours left before it reached the time limit. Izuku sighed in content, leaning back in his chair to relax. It was still early, and he doubted that his mother was up yet. Looking around, he figured it wouldn't be too bad if he left his room, so that's what the boy did, carefully opening his bedroom door so as not to make a sound. Gami closed behind him. He slinked into the kitchen, grabbing the box of Mighty Smacks cereal quietly from the countertop. It was his favorite cereal, though quite sugary. He poured himself a bowl as best he could, spilling a bit here and there. Putting the box back and cleaning up his mess, Izuku took his dry cereal to the living room where he softly dropped himself down on the couch. Gami followed him into the room, but trailed behind, looking around the room itself. There were a few pictures on the walls. Most of them were of Izuku and his mother. They looked happy together, with the young boy smiling brightly in each one. Inko smiled as well, but nothing could compare to the ball of sunshine that was his successor. It was like Gami could see the physical waves of happiness just rolling off the child in each photo. There was one picture with Hisashi. It was of his wedding day. He and Inko stood in the center of a large white archway, decorated with beautiful red roses. Inko herself looked happier than all the other photos combined, holding her bouquet of roses with a gorgeous smile. Hisashi looked happy as well, though the man seemed to remain stoic most of the time. In the picture, it almost seemed as if Hisashi had been fighting back a smile. But there were no pictures of Izuku and Hisashi together, which Gami found odd. Sure, he didn't like the man, but it didn't make sense for a father to not have any photos with his son. He had only been around Izuku for a day, but judging off of that, he could see that his successor didn't have a good relationship with the man, at least not anymore. Gami had thought that this was a new development, but judging by the absence of a father and son photographs, he was afraid it stemmed far further than that. Of course, he wouldn't dare ask. The boy was probably still overwhelmed with all the responsibility he'd have to tackle on in the last day. Gami didn't want to burden him with more bad memories. "Hey, Gami, are you going to sit?" Izuku piped up, patting his small hand on the empty spot of the couch. The man didn't realize he'd been staring at the wall for so long, but he nodded his head and moved over to the couch. The child smirked as he turned on the TV, immediately beelining for a specific channel. Izuku inwardly cheered as he saw the channel was playing the new Mighty Adventure episodes that he had missed the other day. Putting down the remote, he happily smacked away at his cereal, content in the moment. Gami didn't understand the appeal of the show. He, for one, thought the main character, Mighty Man, was foolish to be reckless, overall a bad example for young children to be looking up to. But seeing the smile on his successor's face, Gami pushed all those thoughts away. If Izuku liked it, then Gami would give it a chance. Inko was definitely startled seeing her son up so early, watching Mighty Adventures while eating cereal. She really hadn't expected him to be up, so she fumbled out a good morning before rushing off to the kitchen. She kept telling herself that her son must have some crazy new schedule, but in reality, she knew exactly what it was. It was the same thing eating at her as well. The past 2 nights had been stressful for the mom. She felt torn in 2 directions. She could understand where her husband was coming from, but at the same time, Izuku was her son. She couldn't just leave him. He was 4, for goodness sake. She shook her head sadly, pouring herself a warm cup of tea. She just needed some more time to think, that was all. Seeing Izuku up so early didn't really help her with her guilt either. In the rush of the moment, Inko made a poor decision, the first of many to come. "Izuku," she started, suddenly pouring her cup of tea into a thermos, "I'm going out to buy some groceries." Her son turned to her, pausing his cartoon, looking as if he wanted to say something. His eyes were big, watery, and sad. Inko jerked her head away from him quickly, not wanting to see his expression, or feel the guilt after. Unbeknownst to her, at her actions, Izuku grew even more depressed, feeling more unwanted than ever. "Okay, Mama," he whimpered. Goodness, his voice sounded so pathetic. Inko cringed, just desperate to just leave the situation. "You know the rules, no leaving the house for any reason. If you need me, call," she repeated monotonously, quickly adding on, "If your father comes home, be good." The child just nodded his head, not trusting his voice to respond without crying. Inko left in a rush, not bothering to grab a jacket or her purse. Gami could feel the sadness coming off of his successor, and honestly, he couldn't blame him. What his mother had just done was harsh and ignorant, and frankly, he was starting to believe that all the adults in this household were complete idiots. Gami had never been good with kids, but seeing the boy look so dejected left a sour taste in his mouth, so he did his best. "I did promise you that I would explain about those powers," he piped up, remembering Izuku's bright face when he had mentioned them yesterday. "Though I will alert you that they're not easy to control." Izuku's head shot up, eyes wide and curious. "But I suppose that will not stop you." The child shook his head, eager to know where Gami was going with this. The episode of Mighty Adventures was still paused. The man put his hands forth, gesturing for the boy to meet them. Izuku hesitantly raised his arms to Gami's. He was expecting that the man would be ice cold, and he was. Gami's skeletal hands peeked out from under his sleeves, and were so freezing he almost flinched away from the touch. But the figure didn't seem to notice, now grasping Izuku's small wrists in each hand. "The first ability I will educate you on is named Death's Touch," he pressed on, "and we're starting with it first because it's the most dangerous." The child grew doe-eyed at the name of this power. Death's Touch. Did that mean that he could kill whatever he touched? Izuku shivered at that fact, or it could have been Gami's cold ice hands. He wasn't too sure at this point. Death's Touch works similarly to a decay quirk. He tried to put it in the best way for his successor to understand. It begins to decay anything you touch, regardless of the amount of fingers. That's why I grabbed your hands. It's known to escalate with one's emotional state. Well, that's fair, Izuku thought. He probably would have grabbed the couch in terror if Gami wasn't holding on to him. Your subconscious controls this ability. However, with proper training, you can learn to control certain aspects of this power. We cannot practice now, unfortunately, as you would likely destroy many things in this house. However, we can tomorrow, as you'll be outside for recess. The boy nodded at that. The woods during recess were probably the best place to practice. He just had to make sure Kachan or the others didn't go with him. For now, just be wary of what you touch. You may accidentally activate it. Izuku gulped nervously. How hard could that be? A few spoons and a cabinet handle were missing by the time Inko came home. Izuku had been sorting his nightly batch of souls when his father came home. He had tried to drown out the yelling, but nothing could do much against his father's harsh and violent voice. Gami was trying his best to distract him, but there was only so much the poor man could do. The boy just took a deep breath and intensified his gaze on the souls in his hands. He hummed quietly to himself, just a last-ditched attempt to fill his mind with anything but the yelling. Izuku was sure it would pass. As it did for the nights before, he just needed to wait. Then a slap echoed from the kitchen. His mother's voice stopped. Izuku froze in his tracks for the second time that day. All he could hear was his father's yelling, not his own humming, not Gami's desperate cries to grab his attention, not even his mother. The child didn't realize he had gotten up from his chair. He didn't realize he had left the safety of his bedroom. He didn't realize that he was now standing in the kitchen, shielding his mother's fallen body with his own. "Papa, please stop," Izuku cried, not knowing what else to do. He raised his hands out at his sides, trying to take the target off of his mother. "You quirkless misfit," Hizashi yelled. "Get out of my way." He cried harder. "Please, Papa, please." "I said get out of my way." Izuku didn't really remember much after that, just that he was hot. So hot. His chest felt the worst, though. It was hot and itchy, and the boy just wanted to scratch it. Although he did remember his mother's screams. Hopefully she didn't get hurt. If only he was stronger. If only he had a quirk. Then maybe he could have protected his mom better. Her scream will haunt him forever. He also remembered Hizashi saying something to him, but not exactly what. What he did remember was the laughing, his father's laughter bouncing around in his head, taunting him, like a hyena cackling, but with a slight cough to it. Almost like his father's throat was filled up with smoke. His eyes were screwed shut, so all he could hear was the laughing. What was so funny? Especially when Izuku was hurting. He wished he could have asked. Maybe next weekend. Maybe next visit. The next visit never comes. Izuku woke up for school the next day, with bandages wrapped around his chest and shoulder. It still burns. Gami is at his bedside, asking if he's all right. Izuku isn't really sure. On his way out, the boy sneaks a glance at his mother, in her bedroom. She doesn't have any bandages. School itself had been really awful. Word had somehow gotten around that Midoriya was quirkless. He hadn't even said anything yet. The children were just about and as accepting as his father was on the whole thing. They surrounded him like they did when Kacchan got his quirk, but it definitely wasn't the same. He wished that they would at least stop hitting the spot where his bandages are, but surprisingly it wasn't one of the punches that hurt the most. It was Kacchan, his bestest friend in the whole wide world, and what he said to him. "What a disappointment," he started. "I can't have a worthless Deku as my sidekick." But Kacchan," Midoriya cried, "I can still be a hero. We can save people together." "You really don't get it," Bakugo continued. "How the hell can a quirkless, useless Deku like you ever be a hero?" Midoriya had never wanted to cry harder than in that moment. He felt so lost, so alone. The only thing reminding him that he still existed was Gami's hand ruffling through his hair. The only thing that he was looking forward to at this point was Gami's company. And recess couldn't come fast enough. So, Death's touch works like a decay quirk. It affects both living and non-living things. Midoriya did his best to pay attention. Right now, this power is extremely volatile. You could end up accidentally decaying something you don't mean to. But with the right practice, you can learn to control it better. Gami pointed one of his thin fingers towards a leaf lying on the ground. "Pick up that leaf over there and then decay it." Midoriya went to go grab the leaf, but just as he touched it, it shriveled up completely and wilted away. Gami looked a bit confused, but the child couldn't really tell. "Try that other leaf," he said, gesturing towards another fallen leaf. The boy went to pick up the other leaf, but the exact same thing happened. Gami didn't really know what to do. "Maybe try that rock over there." Midoriya hesitantly grabbed the rock, but nothing happened. He picked it up and tossed it from hand to hand. The rock stayed complete. "All right, now try to." But before Gami could finish, the rock started to crack. His successor dropped the rock in something of shock and horror. The rock landed with a soft thud on the dusty ground, but continued to crack. Chunks of the stone started to flake off before eventually the whole rock was lost to the breeze. Gami sighed. This might be a little harder than he thought. After recess, Gami and Midoriya had gotten a good handle on what he could and couldn't do with Death's Touch, mostly due to Gami's experience with the power and Midoriya's analysis skills. Both were tired, but feeling proud of the progress that they'd made today. It was discovered that the power was harder for the boy to control on plants, but easier on non-living objects. Granted, the duo still didn't know where humans or animals fit on that scale. There was still a lot of work to be done, but the man and his successor were feeling quite good about themselves in that moment. That is, until Bakugo and the others showed up. "So, Deku, where were you at recess today?" one of Bakugo's underlings sneered. I was just hanging out near the forest," Midoriya whimpered. "So you think you're too cool to hang out with us anymore?" another jumped in. No, that's not it at all," the child cried desperately. Bakugo looked at Midoriya with a side glare. His fingers twitched at the sight of his now useless friend. How could he do this to him? How could Deku ruin his dreams like this? Suddenly, Bakugo's hands pushed at Midoriya's chest, and the smaller boy fell to the ground. Bakugo took a few steps forward and towered over his ex-best friend. He held out a hand as if he were offering to hoist him back up, only to explode the air in his palm just moments later, making Midoriya flinch further into the dirt. "Just remember your place, Deku," he scowled. "Don't forget exactly how useless you are." Bakugo turned and walked off, the rest of his lackeys following him. Midoriya sat up as best as he could with the pain in his chest and brought his arms up to his face and cried. He felt Gami's arms wrap around him, the soft robe rubbing against his skin. Gami's heart broke as the boy just cried harder. This concludes Chapter 3 of Deku and Death. It's a great fic, but like I said, it can be sad at times, and I'll always have the trigger warnings for each chapter posted in the description for you guys. I hope y'all are enjoying this one so far. I'll have Chapter 4 updated and posted as soon as possible. Thanks so much for listening.